March 27, 1977. Los Rodeos Airport, Tenerife, Canary Islands, 1:30 p.m. The sun hangs high over the small airport nestled in the mountains of Tenerife, the largest of Spain's Canary Islands. Los Rodeos Airport, officially Tenerife North Airport, is not a major international hub. It's a modest facility designed to handle inter-island traffic and some tourist flights, with a single runway carved into the mountainous terrain at an elevation of over 2,000 feet. On most days, operations here are routine, manageable, almost sleepy compared to the bustling airports of mainland Europe. But today is not a routine day. Today, Los Rodeos is about to become the center of the worst aviation disaster in history, a catastrophe that will kill 583 people in a matter of seconds, not because of mechanical failure or terrorism, but because of a single dismissed radio command, a moment of impatience, and a fatal assumption. The disaster begins not at Tenerife, but 60 miles to the south at Gran Canaria Airport. At approximately 1:15 p.m., a bomb explodes in the florist shop inside Gran Canaria's terminal building. The explosion is part of a terrorist attack by Canarian independence activists. The bomb is small, it causes property damage but no fatalities, but its impact on aviation operations will be catastrophic. Within minutes, Spanish authorities order Gran Canaria Airport closed indefinitely. No planes can land or take off until the facility is searched for additional explosives. This decision sets in motion a chain of events that will overwhelm Los Rodeos Airport and create the perfect conditions for disaster. In the air at this moment are dozens of flights bound for Gran Canaria, passenger jets from across Europe, carrying tourists to the sunny beaches of the Canary Islands. When pilots receive word that Gran Canaria is closed, they need an alternate destination immediately. The obvious choice is Los Rodeos, less than 100 miles away. Air traffic control begins diverting flights to Los Rodeos, and what seems like a reasonable solution will prove to be disastrous. Among the diverted aircraft are two Boeing 747s, the largest passenger aircraft in the world at the time. These massive jumbo jets represent the pinnacle of 1970s aviation technology, capable of carrying over 400 passengers across oceans, but they are also enormous, unwieldy on the ground, and demanding of airport infrastructure. The first 747 is KLM Flight 4805, operated by KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. The aircraft departed Amsterdam at 9:31 a.m., carrying 234 passengers and 14 crew members, mostly Dutch tourists heading for a sunny holiday. The crew is led by Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, one of KLM's most senior and respected pilots. Captain Van Zanten is 50 years old, and has logged over 11,700 flight hours, with 1,545 hours in the Boeing 747. He is KLM's chief 747 flight instructor, the man responsible for training other pilots. His face appears in KLM's promotional materials. He is considered one of the airline's best pilots, a consummate professional who represents the highest standards of Dutch aviation. With Van Zanten in the cockpit are First Officer Klaas Meurs 42, who recently completed his 747 certification under Van Zanten's instruction, and Flight Engineer Willem Schroeder, 48, responsible for monitoring the aircraft's systems. The second 747 is Pan American World Airways Flight 1736, operated by Pan Am, America's flagship international airline. The aircraft departed Los Angeles the previous evening, stopped in New York, then crossed the Atlantic to Gran Canaria. The flight carries 378 passengers and 16 crew members, a nearly full load of American tourists, many elderly passengers on package tours. In command of the Pan Am flight is Captain Victor Grubbs, 56, a highly experienced pilot with over 21,000 flight hours. His first officer is Robert Bragg, 39, and the flight engineer is George Warnes, 40. Like the KLM crew, they are professionals with years of experience. Captain Grubbs is known for his careful, methodical approach, a by-the-book captain who doesn't take unnecessary risks. Both 747s are diverted to Los Rodeos. The KLM flight arrives first at approximately 1:38 p.m., the Pan Am flight lands minutes later. They join a growing crowd of diverted aircraft, at least a dozen planes, all suddenly crammed onto an airport designed to handle a fraction of this traffic. Los Rodeos Airport in 1977 is not equipped to handle multiple wide-body jets simultaneously. The terminal is small, the apron, the parking area, is limited. The single runway is adequate for 747 operations but has minimal taxiway infrastructure. As diverted aircraft continue to arrive, the situation becomes increasingly chaotic. The small terminal is overwhelmed with passengers. Aircraft are parked wherever space can be found, blocking taxiways. The KLM 747 is directed to park at the end of the taxiway, blocking access for other aircraft. The Pan Am 747 parks behind it. The weather begins to deteriorate. Los Rodeos sits at 2,000 feet elevation in mountainous terrain, and clouds frequently form around the peaks. By mid-afternoon, fog begins to roll across the airport, reducing visibility. This is not unusual for Los Rodeos. The airport is notorious for sudden fog banks, but today, with operations already stressed, the fog adds another dangerous complication. Passengers on both 747s are frustrated. They were supposed to land at Gran Canaria. Instead, they've been sitting at this small mountain airport for over an hour. Most remain on board, waiting. The KLM crew faces a specific problem: duty time limitations. European regulations limit how many hours crew members can be on duty before they must rest. Captain Van Zanten and his crew are approaching their limits. If they exceed these limits, they will be grounded in Tenerife, unable to fly back to Amsterdam. This would create enormous complications: passengers accommodated overnight, a relief crew flown in, the aircraft out of service. Van Zanten is acutely aware of this problem. As KLM's chief instructor and a senior captain, he feels personal responsibility for the airline's operations. The idea of being stranded in Tenerife is unacceptable to him. He needs to get this aircraft back to Amsterdam quickly. At approximately 2:30 p.m., word arrives that Gran Canaria Airport has been cleared and is reopening. The diverted aircraft can finally proceed to their destinations, but this creates a new problem. How do all these aircraft crammed into Los Rodeos depart in an orderly fashion? Air traffic control begins sequencing departures, but the congested apron and limited taxiway make this difficult. The KLM crew requests refueling. They need sufficient fuel to reach Amsterdam from Gran Canaria. Refueling takes approximately 35 minutes. While the KLM aircraft is being refueled, it cannot move, and it blocks other aircraft from accessing the taxiway. Captain Van Zanten becomes increasingly impatient. He watches the clock, calculating duty times. The fog is getting worse. If it becomes too thick, Los Rodeos might close to departures, trapping him indefinitely. He needs to get airborne. By 4 p.m., the KLM aircraft is refueled, and all passengers are back on board. The Pan Am flight is also ready to depart. But there's a positioning problem. The KLM 747 is at the end of the taxiway. Behind it, blocking its path, are the Pan Am 747 and other aircraft. The apron is so congested there is no room to taxi around. Air traffic control devises a plan. Both 747s will taxi via the main runway itself, since the parallel taxiway is partially blocked. The KLM flight will taxi down the runway first, proceed to the far end, then turn around and position for takeoff. The Pan Am flight will follow behind, taxiing on the runway but exiting onto a taxiway before the KLM flight begins its takeoff roll. Once Pan Am has cleared the runway via the taxiway, KLM can take off. It's not ideal. Using the runway as a taxiway is not standard, but given the congestion it seems workable. At 4:58 p.m., the KLM flight receives clearance to taxi. Captain Van Zanten releases the brakes, and the massive 747 begins to move. The KLM flight taxis onto the runway and begins proceeding down its length. Visibility is poor, the fog is thick, reducing sight distance to perhaps 300 to 500 meters in places. Van Zanten can see the runway ahead, but not very far. Behind the KLM aircraft, the Pan Am 747 also receives clearance to taxi. They are supposed to exit the runway at the third taxiway intersection designated C3, which will take them off the runway and allow the KLM flight to take off behind them, but in the fog, identifying the correct taxiway is difficult. The markings are not ideal, and visibility is limited. The stage is now set for disaster. Both 747s are on the same runway, one behind the other, in thick fog. The KLM aircraft is at the far end, preparing to turn around for takeoff. The Pan Am aircraft is somewhere behind, taxiing forward, looking for the taxiway exit. Communication will be hampered by radio congestion and language barriers. And critically, there is no ground radar at Los Rodeos. The controllers cannot see where the aircraft are. They are relying entirely on pilot reports and mental calculations of where each aircraft should be. Captain Van Zanten brings the KLM 747 to the end of the runway and begins a 180-degree turn, positioning for takeoff. The nose swings around until it points back down the runway. Van Zanten runs through pre-takeoff checks. Flaps are set, engines are spooled up. Everything is ready, but somewhere down the runway, hidden in the fog, the Pan Am 747 is still taxiing, still searching for the C3 taxiway exit, still on the runway. The two aircraft are on a collision course, and nobody fully realizes it yet. At 5:02 p.m., Captain Van Zanten advances the throttles. The four engines roar to life, generating over 200,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft begins to roll forward, accelerating for takeoff. But there is a critical problem. Van Zanten has not received explicit takeoff clearance from the tower. In the cockpit, First Officer Mers notices the captain beginning the takeoff roll and questions whether they have clearance. Van Zanten either doesn't hear him or dismisses the concern. Mers attempts to clarify by radioing the tower. KLM 4805 is now at takeoff. This phrase is ambiguous. It could mean positioned at the takeoff point, or taking off. The tower controller responds, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." This is an explicit instruction to wait. But the transmission is stepped on, overlapped by another radio transmission from the Pan Am crew, and parts of it are garbled or not heard clearly in the KLM cockpit. At almost the same moment, the Pan Am crew transmits, "We're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736. They are trying to clarify that they have not yet exited the runway." This transmission overlaps with the tower's transmission to KLM, creating interference. Captain Van Zanten, focused on the takeoff roll, apparently hears neither transmission clearly. Or perhaps he assumes the Pan Am aircraft must have exited by now, that the tower would not allow him to take off if another aircraft were still on the runway. He continues accelerating. In the Pan Am cockpit, Captain Grubbs and First Officer Bragg are still looking for the C3 taxiway in the fog. They pass the first intersection but continue forward, searching. The visibility is so poor they're having trouble seeing the markings. Then suddenly through the fog ahead, the crew sees lights, bright landing lights. Coming toward them. Fast, there he is. Someone shouts. "Look at him, god damn, that son of a bitch is coming." It is the KLM 747, traveling at over 150 miles per hour, hurtling down the runway directly toward them. Captain Grubbs reacts instantly. He shoves the throttles forward, trying to accelerate the Pan Am aircraft and get it off the runway, off the centerline, anywhere out of the way. Get off, he yells. The massive 747 begins to move, but it is slow, ponderous. At taxi speed, the aircraft cannot accelerate quickly. Grubbs turns the nose wheel, trying to steer off the runway onto the grass, but there is no time at all. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Zanten sees the Pan Am aircraft through the fog at the last possible moment. He pulls back on the control column, trying to force the aircraft into the air before reaching the obstacle. The KLM 747's nose lifts as the nose wheel comes off the runway. The aircraft is rotating for takeoff, but it has not reached rotation speed. It is not ready to fly. Van Zanten is trying desperately to will the massive aircraft into the air, dragging its tail along the runway as he pulls back with all his strength. For a brief, horrible moment, it seems like it might work. The KLM aircraft is lifting, the nose high, the main landing gear still on the runway, but possibly clearing the Pan Am aircraft. If Van Zanten can get just a few more feet of altitude, if he can lift the main gear before reaching the other plane, but physics is unforgiving. The KLM 747 has not reached flying speed. It does not have sufficient airspeed to sustain flight. The main landing gear, two massive bogies supporting most of the aircraft's 350-ton weight, are still firmly on the runway. At 5:06 p.m. and 47 seconds, The KLM 747's landing gear slams into the upper fuselage of the Pan Am 747. The impact occurs at over 160 miles per hour. The collision is catastrophic. The landing gear shears through the Pan Am aircraft's fuselage like a giant blade, cutting through metal, seats, passengers, and structure. The Pan Am fuselage is ripped open along its entire upper length, the roof peeled back like opening a sardine can. The KLM aircraft's landing gear is torn completely off by the impact. The sound is indescribable, a tremendous metallic shriek of tearing aluminum, breaking composite materials, shattering glass, and human screams. The KLM 747, now missing its landing gear, and with massive damage to its underside, continues forward and slightly upward for another 500 feet. Without landing gear and with critical structural damage, it cannot maintain flight. The aircraft settles back to the runway, skids forward on its belly, then veers off the runway to the left. The fuel tanks rupture immediately, thousands of gallons of jet fuel, highly flammable kerosene spill across the wreckage. The friction of metal scraping on concrete, electrical systems shorting, any of 100 possible ignition sources create the inevitable spark. The fireball is instantaneous and enormous. The KLM aircraft is consumed in a massive explosion of burning fuel. The entire aircraft, all 231 feet of length, 195 feet of wingspan, is engulfed in flames within seconds. The fire is so intense that metal melts, aluminum runs like water, titanium components glow white hot. The temperature inside the fuselage reaches over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody inside the KLM aircraft has a chance. The combination of impact forces and immediate fire kills everyone instantly, or within seconds. All 234 passengers and 14 crew members, 248 people total, die. There are no survivors from the KLM flight. The Pan Am 747, its upper fuselage ripped open, also catches fire immediately. Fuel from the KLM aircraft's ruptured tanks has sprayed across the Pan Am wreckage, coating it in flammable liquid that ignites. The forward section of the Pan Am aircraft, the cockpit and first-class cabin, remains relatively intact structurally, though it is rapidly filling with thick toxic smoke. The midsection, where the KLM landing gear struck, is devastated, the fuselage torn open to the sky, bodies and seats and debris scattered across the runway. But unlike the KLM aircraft, not everyone on the Pan Am plane dies immediately. The forward section has not exploded into a fireball. Some passengers and crew in this section survive the initial impact and have precious moments, perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps less, to react before the fire overwhelms them. The cockpit crew, Captain Grubbs, First Officer Bragg and Flight Engineer Warnes survive the collision. They are injured, bleeding, disoriented, but conscious. Captain Grubbs realizes immediately that they need to evacuate. "Get out, everyone get out," he shouts into the intercom, though he doesn't know if the cabin crew can hear him. The cockpit is filling with smoke. Flames are visible through the windows. The heat is already intense. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants immediately begin emergency procedures. Those who survived the impact, and are not incapacitated, start shouting for passengers to unbuckle and move toward exits. But many exits are blocked by wreckage or fire, others are jammed shut by the structural deformation of the fuselage. Passengers in the midsection, where the impact occurred, have no chance. Most are already dead from the collision, and those who aren't are trapped in a rapidly spreading inferno. But in the forward cabin, there is a narrow window of survival. The forward left door, door 1L in aviation terminology, can be opened. A flight attendant struggles with it, fighting the mechanism, and finally gets it open. An evacuation slide is supposed to deploy automatically, but the system has been damaged. The slide does not inflate. The door is open, but it's a 20-foot drop to the tarmac below. People begin jumping. There is no other option. Stay and burn, or jump and risk injury. Passengers leap from the doorway, some landing badly, breaking bones but alive. Others help each other, lowering children and elderly passengers as much as possible before letting them drop. Dorothy Kelly, a passenger sitting in row 9, survives the impact. She is cut and bruised but mobile. She follows other passengers toward the forward door. The smoke is choking, making it almost impossible to breathe. The heat from the fire behind them is like standing near a blast furnace. She reaches the door, sees the drop, and jumps. She hits the ground hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but she's alive. She scrambles away from the burning aircraft. Paul and Floy Heck, an elderly couple from California, celebrating their wedding anniversary with a European vacation, survive the initial impact. Paul helps Floy to the exit, practically carrying her. He gets her to the door and helps lower her down, then jumps himself. Both survive, though they are injured. Paul will later say he looked back and saw the entire rear section of the aircraft engulfed in flames, heard screaming from inside, knew that hundreds of people were still trapped. The guilt of surviving when so many died will haunt him for the rest of his life. First Officer Bob Bragg evacuates through a cockpit window. Despite his injuries, he has suffered head trauma and burns. He breaks out a cockpit window and climbs through, dropping to the tarmac below. Captain Victor Grubbs also escapes through the cockpit area, though he is severely burned. His hands, arms and face are scorched. Flight engineer George Warnes makes it out as well, helping other crew members evacuate. Joan Feathers, the Pan Am purser, the chief flight attendant, survives the impact in the forward galley. Despite being injured and in shock, she immediately begins directing passengers to usable exits. She will later be credited with saving multiple lives, remaining calm and professional, even as the aircraft burned around her. She is one of the last to evacuate, making sure as many people as possible got out before she finally jumped from the burning plane herself. In total, 61 people escaped from the Pan Am aircraft, 54 passengers and 7 crew members. Given the severity of the collision and fire, it is miraculous that anyone survived, but these 61 survivors come at a terrible cost. 335 people on the Pan Am flight died, 317 passengers and 9 crew members, most of them in the mid and rear sections where there was no escape. The fire burns with such intensity that firefighters, arriving at the scene within minutes, cannot approach the wreckage. They spray water and foam on the flames from a distance, but the fuel fire burns with such ferocity that their efforts are largely futile. The heat is overwhelming. The smoke is thick, black and toxic. The scene is apocalyptic. 2 of the world's largest aircraft, reduced to burning hulks on a fog-shrouded runway, with human remains scattered across hundreds of meters. The total death toll is 583 people, 248 from KLM, 335 from Pan Am. It is the deadliest aviation accident in history. It exceeds the death toll of any previous air disaster. To put it in perspective, it is more deaths than the September 11th attacks on the Pentagon, more than the Chicago DC-10 crash, more than the Japan Airlines 747 crash that would occur 8 years later. And it remains to this day the deadliest accident in aviation history. In the aftermath of the disaster, investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States converge on Tenerife to determine what happened and why. The investigation is led by the Spanish Aviation Authority, with participation from the Dutch Aviation Safety Board and the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board. The physical evidence is clear. The KLM aircraft struck the Pan Am aircraft on the runway. Both aircraft were destroyed by impact and fire, and 583 people died. But the critical question is why? Why were both aircraft on the same runway at the same time? Why did Captain Van Zanten begin his takeoff roll when another aircraft was in his path? What failures in communication, procedure, and judgment led to this catastrophe? Investigators recover the cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders from both aircraft. The CVRs are partially damaged by fire but yield critical information. The recordings reveal the sequence of radio transmissions in the final minutes before the collision. When investigators play back the tapes, they hear something chilling, the tower controller clearly saying, "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you." It was an explicit instruction to wait, but in the KLM cockpit that message was never clearly heard. The reason becomes apparent when investigators analyze the radio recordings more carefully. At the exact moment the tower controller was telling KLM to wait, the Pan Am crew was transmitting their own message: "We're still taxiing down the runway." The 2 transmissions occurred simultaneously, overlapping each other on the same radio frequency. This created what engineers call heterodyne interference, a high-pitched squeal that made both transmissions difficult or impossible to understand clearly. Captain Van Zanten, focused on his instruments and the takeoff roll, heard neither message clearly, or if he heard fragments, he didn't register their critical importance. Investigators also scrutinized the language used in the radio communications. When First Officer Mers transmitted "We are now at takeoff," what did he mean? Was he reporting their position, "We are now at the takeoff point"? Or was he announcing an action, "We are now taking off"? The phrase was ambiguous, unclear, open to interpretation. Standard aviation phraseology exists precisely to prevent such ambiguity, but in the stress and confusion of the moment, Mers used imprecise language, and that imprecision contributed to the fatal misunderstanding. The investigation reveals another critical failure. Los Rodeos Airport had no ground radar system. The controllers in the tower could not see where aircraft were on the runway or taxiways. In good visibility they could look out the windows and see aircraft positions. But in the fog that afternoon, visibility was near zero. The controllers were essentially operating blind, relying entirely on what pilots told them over the radio and their own mental picture of where each aircraft should be. When the Pan Am crew reported they were still on the runway, the controller knew there was a problem, but he couldn't see either aircraft to verify their positions or to realize that KLM was already accelerating down the runway. As investigators pieced together the timeline and the decisions made, a picture emerges of Captain Van Zanten under intense self-imposed pressure. He was watching the clock, calculating his duty time, knowing that every minute on the ground brought him closer to exceeding his legal limits. If he went over, he would be stranded in Tenerife, his passengers would be delayed, his airline would face costs and complications. For a man of Van Zanten's seniority and professionalism, such an outcome was unacceptable. He needed to get this aircraft airborne. Psychologists studying the accident identify what they call confirmation bias in Van Zanten's decision-making. He expected the Pan Am aircraft to be off the runway. He had heard, or thought he heard, communications suggesting Pan Am was exiting. When he received ambiguous information, he interpreted it in a way that confirmed what he expected to be true, rather than questioning his assumptions. He heard what he wanted to hear, and that cognitive bias, combined with his urgency to depart, led him to make a fatal decision to begin takeoff without explicit clearance, and without being certain the runway was clear. But perhaps most troubling to investigators is what they hear, or more precisely what they don't hear, on the cockpit voice recorder from the KLM aircraft. Both the first officer and the flight engineer expressed uncertainty. First Officer Mers seemed to question whether they had clearance. Flight engineer Schroeder made a comment that suggested doubt, but neither man forcefully challenged the captain's decision to take off. Neither said "Stop, we don't have clearance." Neither insisted that Van Zanten abort the takeoff roll. Why not? The answer lies in the cockpit culture of the era. In the 1970s, captains held absolute authority in the cockpit. They were gods in their domain. Junior crew members did not question captains' decisions, especially when that captain was the chief instructor, the most senior pilot in the fleet, the man whose face appeared on recruitment posters. First Officer Mers had been trained by Van Zanten himself. To directly contradict or challenge such a figure would have required extraordinary courage, and in the critical seconds when such a challenge might have prevented disaster, neither crew member found that courage. The investigation's final report, issued in 1978, assigns primary responsibility to Captain Van Zanten for initiating takeoff without clearance, and without being certain the runway was clear. But the report also acknowledges the multiple contributing factors, the radio communication problems that prevented critical information from being transmitted clearly, the airport's inadequate infrastructure that forced both aircraft onto the active runway, the lack of ground radar that left controllers blind in the fog, and the general confusion created by the multiple diversions and deteriorating weather. What investigators are really describing, though they don't use exactly these words, is a perfect storm of failures. No single factor caused the disaster, rather multiple small failures, each manageable on its own, aligned in exactly the wrong way at exactly the wrong time. Remove any one of these factors, and 583 people might have lived. But with all factors present simultaneously, catastrophe became inevitable. The Tenerife disaster sent shockwaves through the aviation industry worldwide. If two of the world's most advanced aircraft, flown by experienced crews from prestigious airlines, could collide on a runway in broad daylight, then something was fundamentally wrong with how aviation operated. The industry had to change. Within months of the disaster, airlines and aviation authorities began implementing reforms. The International Civil Aviation Organization mandated stricter adherence to standard phraseology for all radio communications. Controllers were required to use specific, unambiguous language when issuing clearances. The word takeoff could now only be used when explicitly granting or acknowledging takeoff clearance, no more ambiguous phrases like a takeoff that could mean different things to different people. But the most profound changes came in cockpit culture. Aviation psychologists and safety experts recognized that the hierarchical, authoritarian structure in cockpits was dangerous. If junior crew members couldn't or wouldn't speak up when they saw problems, then critical safety information was being lost. Airlines worldwide began implementing what became known as crew resource management training. was revolutionary. It taught cockpit crews to function as teams rather than hierarchies. Captains were trained to solicit input from their crew, and to create an environment where speaking up was encouraged rather than punished. First officers and flight engineers were trained not just to notice problems, but to assertively communicate them, even if it meant contradicting the captain. The training used real accident case studies, including Tenerife, to show crews the deadly consequences of poor communication and excessive deference to authority. In CRM training sessions, pilots watched the Tenerife accident unfold through the lens of cockpit voice recorder transcripts. They hear First Officer Mehr's tentative questions, Flight Engineer Schroeder's uncertain comments, and Captain Van Zanten's disregard for their concerns. Instructors pause the recording and ask what should have happened here, how should the first officer have communicated his concern, what words should he have used. The answers become training standards. Captain, I'm not comfortable proceeding without explicit clearance. Captain, I believe we need to hold position. Captain, stop the aircraft now. Major airports around the world installed ground radar systems, technology that allows controllers to see where every aircraft is on the airport's surface, even in zero visibility. These systems, combined with improved runway lighting and signage, dramatically reduced the risk of runway incursions. Controllers could now verify visually what pilots were telling them over the radio. The disaster also accelerated improvements in cockpit voice recorder technology. The value of CVRs in understanding what happened at Tenerife was undeniable. Requirements for recording quality, recording duration, and crash survivability were all enhanced. Modern CVRs record multiple audio channels for extended periods, and are built to survive impacts and fires that would destroy most other aircraft components. Perhaps most importantly, the industry's entire approach to safety evolved. Before Tenerife, accidents were often attributed to pilot error or controller error, individual failures by individual people. After Tenerife, investigators began looking at systemic factors. Why did this person make this error? What about the system allowed or encouraged this mistake? How can we redesign the system to prevent similar errors in the future? This shift from blaming individuals to fixing systems has made modern aviation extraordinarily safe. The industry learned that most accidents result not from malicious or incompetent people, but from good people making understandable mistakes in challenging circumstances. The solution is not to punish those people, but to design systems that catch mistakes before they become catastrophes. Behind the statistics and safety improvements lie the human stories of 583 people whose lives were cut short on a foggy runway. The victims came from dozens of countries, though most were Dutch or American. They were families on vacation, elderly couples on tours, business travelers, flight crew simply doing their jobs. They had lives, families, dreams, futures, all extinguished in seconds. In the Netherlands, the loss of 248 citizens was a national tragedy. Television broadcasts were interrupted to announce the disaster. Newspapers ran special editions. The Dutch nation mourned. KLM, the proud flag carrier, was devastated. The airline supported victims' families financially and emotionally, but the company's reputation suffered. Their most senior captain, The man they had trusted to represent the airline's highest standards had caused the world's deadliest air disaster. For Van Zanten's family, the tragedy was compounded by unbearable complexity. They lost a husband, a father, a loved one. But they also had to cope with the knowledge that he was responsible for killing 582 other people. How do you mourn someone you love while knowing what they did? How do you grieve when the world sees your loved one, not as a victim, but as the perpetrator? Van Zanten's widow and children faced this impossible burden, and the Dutch public, while sympathetic to their loss, could not forget the other 247 Dutch citizens who died because of Van Zanten's decision. In the United States, the Pan Am disaster was front-page news for days. President Carter sent condolences to the families. American embassies in Europe worked to assist relatives trying to reach Tenerife or arrange for remains to be returned home. Many of the victims were elderly passengers on what was supposed to be a dream vacation, perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Europe, saved for and planned for years. Their families had to cope not only with sudden shocking loss, but with the terrible randomness of it. If the bomb at Gran Canaria had exploded an hour later, if the fog had lifted sooner, if any of 1,000 small things had been different, their loved ones would have come home. The survivors from the Pan Am aircraft carried their own burdens. They had escaped death by seconds, by feet, by pure chance. Many developed severe PTSD, plagued by nightmares of fire and screaming, unable to board aircraft again. Some felt overwhelming guilt. Why did I survive when the person next to me died? What made me deserve to live when so many died? These are questions with no good answers, questions that many survivors wrestled with for decades. Captain Victor Grubbs, the Pan Am captain who survived, never flew commercially again. His injuries, particularly his burns, were severe enough to end his flying career, but beyond the physical injuries, he carried the psychological weight of the disaster. He had done everything right, he had tried to avoid the collision, had attempted to save his passengers, but 335 people under his command died anyway. First Officer Bob Bragg eventually returned to flying, but later said the accident haunted him for the rest of his life. Today, memorials exist both at Tenerife and in the Netherlands commemorating the victims. At Tenerife North Airport, the renamed Los Rodeos, a memorial garden honors those who died. In Amsterdam, near Schiphol Airport, another memorial stands. Every year on March 27th, survivors, families and aviation professionals gather to remember the 583 people who died, and to renew their commitment to the safety improvements that followed the disaster. The Tenerife disaster teaches us that catastrophe rarely has a single cause. It results from multiple failures aligning in the worst possible way, what safety experts call the Swiss cheese model of accidents. Imagine multiple slices of Swiss cheese, each with holes in different places. Normally, the holes don't align, and hazards are blocked by at least one layer of defense, but occasionally, purely by chance, all the holes align perfectly, and a hazard passes straight through every defensive layer. At Tenerife, every hole aligned. A terrorist bomb closed Gran Canaria. Dozens of flights were diverted to Los Rodeos. The small airport was overwhelmed. The weather deteriorated into fog. Ground radar didn't exist. The taxiway was blocked, forcing aircraft onto the runway. The captain was under time pressure. Radio communications overlapped at exactly the wrong moment. The crew didn't forcefully challenge the captain. The Pan Am aircraft couldn't find the taxiway exit quickly enough. Remove any one of these factors and the disaster doesn't happen. If Gran Canaria hadn't closed, both planes would have landed there safely. If Los Rodeos had had better infrastructure, the aircraft wouldn't have been on the runway together. If the fog had lifted, Van Zanten would have seen the Pan Am plane. If there had been ground radar, controllers could have prevented the takeoff. If the radio transmissions hadn't overlapped, Van Zanten would have heard the standby instruction. If the first officer had forcefully insisted on verification, the captain might have stopped. But all these failures did happen simultaneously, and 583 people died. The most haunting aspect is the timescale. 30 seconds, that's all it would have taken. If Van Zanten had waited 30 seconds for explicit clearance, if the Pan Am aircraft had found the taxiway 30 seconds earlier, 30 seconds, the time it takes to tie your shoes, to drink a cup of coffee, to send a text message. 30 seconds that separated life from death for 583 people. Aviation learned from Tenerife. The safety culture that emerged from the disaster's ashes has saved countless lives in the decades since. Modern commercial aviation is the safest form of mass transportation ever devised by humans. You are safer during a transatlantic flight than you are driving to the grocery store. That safety record exists because disasters like Tenerife taught the industry what can go wrong and how to prevent it. When pilots today go through CRM training, they study Tenerife. When air traffic controllers learn about the importance of standard phraseology, they study Tenerife. When airport designers plan runway and taxiway layouts, they consider the lessons of Tenerife. When aviation authorities write regulations about crew duty times, they remember that time pressure contributed to Tenerife. The 583 people who died on March 27, 1977, did not die in vain. Their deaths forced an industry to confront its weaknesses and change fundamentally. Every person who has flown safely in the decades since owes something to the lessons learned from that foggy runway in the Canary Islands. But we must never forget that those 583 people should not have died at all. The disaster was preventable. It resulted from human error, from pressure, from assumptions, from a few seconds of impatience. One captain dismissed a wait command, and 583 people paid with their lives. May we never forget them, and may we never stop learning from their deaths.